Hey, this is Concept. Today we're going to talk about minimizing election and politically
Open
related
with
violence.
collabs with concept you see.
I support the red team. I support the blue team. Whatever team you're on, most people are worried about election or politically based violence. A 2024 Pew's research study showed that 66% of US voters say they are worried about the threat of political violence. And this is members of both of the major US parties, Republicans and Democrats. And it would appear for good reason. An article from Reuters in August 2023 noted that political violence is at its highest level since the 1970s. In fact, since the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, Reuters identified 216 cases of political violence. Two-thirds of these involved physical violence against people, with the rest involving property damage. And what can we do to decrease the overall levels of political violence and to avoid it personally ourselves? The surest way to avoid being a victim of violence is to avoid initiating violent situations and altercations. But this may be easier said than done. Quite frankly, there may be situations where violence will seem unavoidable. If you end up in a situation of true resource limitation or are facing ongoing violent persecution, some people are likely going to feel compelled to fight. And really, who can harshly judge them for trying to defend themselves, their children, and their communities? For me personally, I like to take the words of the late great Michael Dowd, who said, "I would rather die side by side with my neighbors than fighting my neighbors." And I hope that I might have the courage to execute those words if I'm ever faced with the choice. But I digress. Even though some will argue that there may be situations where violence is absolutely unavoidable, it's important to keep in mind that being in a situation of ongoing stress can affect your decision making process and may lead you to choose violence when you don't actually need it. There are many academic studies showing that increased stress levels are associated with increased aggression and violent behavior, regardless of the immediate situation actually faced. Some of those studies are listed here, but I'm not going to talk about them all because that would take too long. The one I will talk about is a very fascinating study that was done in labs in Norway and Hungary. A series of experiments were performed wherein rats had electrodes implanted into their brains in the area of the hypothalamus that causes the rat to behave aggressively. They then placed these electrode implanted rats into cages with sleepy, non implanted rats that had been sedated with morphine and therefore posed no active threat to the implanted rats. They then activated the hypothalamic electrodes and measured how much electricity it took to trigger the implanted rats to attack the sleepy rats, and concurrently measured blood levels of stress hormones. Before you go off on me, let me say that I'm not endorsing that this was an ethical study, but I do think it can teach us a lot about how to avoid human violence. It took less stimulus for a stressed rat to attack a sedated fellow than a non stressed rat, i.e., stress hormones increased the likelihood of aggressive behavior even when there was no active threat of danger. What's more is that through this series of experiments, they found that there was a reciprocal relationship between increased stress hormones and increased activation of the attack area. In other words, increased stress hormones caused increased aggressive behavior, and increased aggressive behavior also caused increased stress hormones. In other words, an increase in stress hormones led to an increase in violent behavior, and an increase in violent behavior led to an increased level of stress hormones and an upward spiral of aggression. This is a great illustration of how and why at times people who are not normally violent can boil over, and people who wouldn't normally engage in violence may do so even if not actively threatened, just from being under extreme levels of stress, especially extreme stress for an extended period of time. And it could be any of us. The fight or flight instinct exists in all of us. What can we do to counter this tendency for extreme stress to lead to unnecessary violence? First, obviously look after your own mental health. Engage in mindfulness activities. I know people roll their eyes at this, or zone out because most discussions of mental health and mindfulness are dripping with platitudes. But mindfulness is no fucking joke. And I'm only swearing to emphasize the importance of my point because it really could save your life or the life of someone you love someday. If someone has a gun to your head, you need to be able to stay calm enough to talk them down. Or if you're stuck somewhere for a week and you only have 3 days worth of supplies, you need to have the mental fortitude to ration appropriately and also get along with the people around you without killing each other. These are real scenarios that have and could happen to anyone. So find a mindfulness activity to regularly engage in. Personally, I'm a big fan of meditation. I don't think it can be beat in terms of improving emotional regulation. But if that's not for you, there are other options. Yoga, running, even art. Just pick something, do it, and do it regularly, and invite others to do it with you. And if you're someone who already does mindfulness activities, tell people about it. We need to normalize mindfulness, especially in a world where people may not have access to their normal mental health care services and medications. Stay present. Don't worry about the future too much. Many people have been projecting various doomsday scenarios that would result, for example, if this or that candidate wins or this or that political action occurs. But those things probably won't happen immediately, even if they're right. So try not to contribute to the general atmosphere of panic. Try to enjoy spending time with the people around you. They won't be around forever. One thing that does not help mental health is doom scrolling. Doom scrolling is associated with increased levels of anxiety and depression. It's not your job to keep up with every piece of bad news in the world. So far, we've discussed managing your own internal environment. But what if you're still confronted by an agitated person who seems to be at risk of committing a violent act? This is where de-escalation techniques come into play. Chris Voss is an award-winning author and ex-FBI hostage negotiator, and a global authority on the topic of persuasive communication. I highly recommend his book, Never Split the Difference, to anyone who has to interact with other people, i.e. almost everyone. This video is already running long, so I'm just going to briefly touch on 3 of his recommendations to quickly de-escalate a person displaying potentially aggressive behavior. Number 1, use a soft, soothing tone of voice to avoid further aggravating the person. Number 2, use tactical empathy to deeply understand what your counterpart is experiencing. By focusing your entire attention on their tone of voice, facial expressions, and body language, you can create neural resonance, which will help you better understand the emotions they are feeling and what it is they truly need in order to stop displaying aggressive behavior. Number 3, try to label your counterpart's negative emotions. For example, it seems that you're angry because, or it seems like you're frustrated because. If you're right, it helps the person diffuse their negative emotions. But even if you're wrong, it shows that you're sincerely trying to understand their experience, and it buys you time. In a later video, I might go into more detail about how to use labeling and how labeling works, because it can be a very powerful technique. But for now, I'll just say, remember, you're dealing with a person who wants to be appreciated and understood. So use labels to reinforce and encourage that you're listening and you care, and to help them release their negative emotions. In conclusion, I'll say violence begets violence, and violent conflict always tends to escalate. Decrease your own risk of acting out by practicing mindfulness techniques in your everyday life. Learn de-escalation techniques for when you encounter an agitated person to decrease their risk of acting out violently and your risk of becoming a victim. Remember, no matter what political group you do or do not support, we're all sharing the same atmosphere and the same oceans on the earth, and most of us will continue to struggle to survive in the setting of increased extreme weather events and increasing global political instability. Regardless of political party, I like to think that we are all actually on the same team, the same Earth team. That's where I'll stop. Let me know in the comments if there are any other collapse-related topics that make you feel anxious or afraid and make it hard for you to live in the moment. Ultimately, These videos are my coping mechanism to help give me meaning as I try to decrease the pain and suffering of others during the extraordinary global events that we are all experiencing together. Thank you guys so much. Good luck out there. Love everyone.
Coping with collapse, with concept you see. Finding the ways to tweak every. Together we'll laugh, bring joy to the day. Join us on this journey, one just play.